Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am, as always, very happy to be here with you and to have a returning author on the podcast. This is actually the first of the next 3 episodes that have returning authors, so that is very cool. I love having guests that I've already spoken to. It's like having an old friend come back and have another conversation with them. Today I am interviewing, as you see from the title of this episode, author Denis Shaughnessy. We are talking about his third/first book. It's a prequel in his Marco Ockrum series. This one's called The Awful Truth About the Herbert Quarry Affair. If you have not heard that first episode, he was on the podcast on episode 214 if you want to check that one out, although this is a prequel, so you can do it in either order. You can listen to this one and then go listen to that one, or you can listen to that one and then come back and listen to this one. Really, it doesn't matter. Even if this wasn't a prequel, you could still listen to that one first or this one first, because of the nature of Marco's series. I don't even know where to begin. I never know where to begin with these books. I love Denis. I love talking to Denis. Denis's brain is a fascinating place, and out of that brain comes really crazy, fun, hilarious, zany books. Let me give you the description of The Awful Truth About the Herbert Quarry Affair by Marco Ockrum, or Denis Shaughnessy. Really just depends on how you look at it. This book actually comes out on June 15th, so you can pre-order it now. Here's the description from Amazon. With a jangle of keys, a door opened. Herbert clanked in, his arms locked to his sides, his ankles shackled, his face a Hannibal Lecter mask. He was overjoyed to see me. "Marco, I'm jailed day and night with murderous thugs who can't tell Schiller from Shakespeare. I'm desperate for intellectual stimulus, but you'll do for now." TV personality Marco Ockrum is the world's only self-penned character, writing his life in real time as you read it. Marco's celebrity mentor, Herbert Quarry, grooms him to be the Jackson Pollock of literature, teaching him to splatter words on a page without thought or revision. Quarry's plan backfires when imbecilic Marco begins to type his first thought-free book. It's a murder mystery, and Herbert's caught red-handed by the butchered body of his lover. Not caught red-handed by the butchered body of his lover, but by the butchered body of his lover. He's by it, not the body didn't catch him. Just making sure I got that correctly when I was reading it to you. Anyway, now Marco must write himself into a crusade to clear his friend's name. Typing the first words that come into his head, Marco unleashes a phantasmagorical catalog of twists in his pursuit of justice, writing the world's fastest-selling book to reveal the awful truth about the Herbert Quarry affair. I can't even read the description without laughing, as I'm sure you noticed. First of all, the word phantasmagorical is in that description. Second, that gives you a really good idea of how these books go, because Marco is writing them as it is writing it as you are reading it. So just, if he needs a plot twist, he just puts one in, and he tells you that he's putting one in. This one happens to, as it says, be the awful truth about the Herbert Quarry affair, and Herbert Quarry is Marco's mentor. So at the beginning of each chapter, or between chapters, however you want to look at it, there are lessons from Herbert to Marco. And I just want to read you lesson number 29, because it'll tell you a lot about Herbert, Marco, maybe even Denis. Let's see. Why do authors write prequels, Herbert? Authors write prequels opportunistically, Marco, to exploit the popularity of a series when they have run out of ideas for sequels. Might an author write a prequel for some other reason? Perhaps to provide an explanatory backstory for certain aspects of a book that mystified its readers? Perhaps, Marco, but a book would have to be exceptionally confusing and poorly conceived to require a prequel to be written for that purpose. Are there golden rules for writing of such a prequel, Herbert? Only one, Marco. If you are writing a prequel to clarify the meaning of existing books in a series, then you must ensure it does not increase the sense of confusion already inflicted upon the unfortunate reader. The chapter then will probably inflict confusion upon us because that is how the lessons tended to work in this book. And then each chapter starts with in which. So let's say chapter 29, that's the one after the lesson I just read you, in which Marco continues to break the golden rule of prequel writing and make the world's least credible excuse to escape his caricature Bronx mom. I can't even read this without laughing. Marco's Bronx mom. He always refers to her as his Bronx mom, which would seem to indicate that he has other moms, but only one that we know of so far, his Bronx mom. I love this series. I love talking to Denis. I'm going to stop babbling about all of that and let you hear Denis for himself. And Denis, you can explain yourself as to where this series and this book came from in that crazy fun brain of yours. So let's now turn to the interview with author Denis Shaughnessy.
Hi, Denis. Welcome back to the podcast.
Sarah, it's just amazing to be back. Thank you ever so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. My only worry, though, Sarah, is because this is now my second time, I won't be able to reuse all my old jokes, so I'll have to try and invent everything from scratch again.
Well, we'll have new listeners who won't have heard your jokes, so you could probably reuse them, and no one will notice.
Blimey, I hadn't thought of that. In that case, I'll try out all the old ones. Yeah.
Excellent. And, it's been a while since we talked, so I maybe have even forgotten some of your old jokes.
I forget them too. Usually in the middle of telling them, yeah.
It'll be new for everyone. Actually, this is foreshadowing and giving some of it away, but if you forget them in the middle of telling them, that means that you maybe are writing them as you tell them, which is
in
very
real
Marco.
time. Yeah. Making it up as I go along. Yeah.
Yes.
Very Marco.
That's right, and we will explain more about that in just a few moments. Before we explain about Marco and the book, the awful truth about the Herbert Quarry affair, which is what you're here to talk about, can you share a little bit about yourself and what you have been up to since the last time we spoke?
Yes, indeed. So for all your lovely listeners, I should explain that in spite of the fact that I have a very youthful voice, I'm really in my very, very late 20s. I think in September I'll be 2042, so that makes me probably at least 3 times as old as you are, Sarah, I'd imagine. I am a theoretical physicist by training. I did a PhD in quantum theory, so if anybody needs to have an explanation from me about quantum theory or relativity or anything like that, then I can explain to all of you why those subjects are so hard that I gave them up as soon as I finished my PhD. Another aspect that might surprise your listeners, particularly those who've read my 2 existing books, is I still haven't won the Nobel Prize, Sarah. So I can only assume there's all kinds of dodgy dealings going on in Stockholm, some backhanders and so on and so forth. And the final thing that might be relevant is that I'm very much a lark, not an owl. So I'm at my best early in the morning. And since it's 6 p.m. here in the UK, if you find me nodding off during the conversation, you'll know why.
I will, and I just want you to know that I have started a letter writing campaign to get you that Nobel Prize.
Oh, fantastic!
So far, it's just one letter, but I'm really hopeful that that's going to increase.
Well, Great things happen with small beginnings, Sarah. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So what have you been up to since we spoke last?
Well, the most relevant thing I've been up to is working with my lovely publishers, Tiny Fox Press, to finish the third of my novels, which is going to be published on the 15th of June. It's called The Awful Truth About the Herbert Quarry Affair, and it is a prequel to two other Awful Truth books, both of which appear to be written by a character called Marco Ockram, which we'll hear a little bit more about shortly. So I've been pretty much tied up all the time on getting ready for the book launch, getting everything exactly right.
All right, wonderful. So let's talk about Marco Ockram and the three books that he/you/he has written. This is the third one, but it's a prequel. So why did you write them in this order? Why, or publish them in this order? I shouldn't assume that you wrote them in this order.
Well, I actually wrote the book I'm about to publish first of all. I should maybe spend a minute or two just explaining for your lovely listeners what these books are like. They are quite unlike anything else your listeners will ever have read, and they're certainly quite unlike anything I've ever read. On the surface, they appear to be comedy thrillers, but what makes them weird is that they purport to be written by their protagonist, Marco Ockram. And Marco is a fictional character who is writing his own existence in real time as you read the books. So they're a very strange concept, really. And the narrative weaves continually between the point of view of Marco, the author, and the point of view of Marco, his own character that he's creating. And there's a kind of conceptual space between those 2 points of views that doesn't crop up really in other types of books. And it's a great recipe for all kinds of fun and games. So the plot of the forthcoming book is that Marco has been coached by his mentor, Herbert, to break the mold of literature by writing in the way that Jackson Pollock painted. So that's throwing the words down on the page without thinking. And Herbert thinks that Marco has an actual talent for writing without thinking because he's such an idiot. So Marco's a wannabe intellectual. He thinks that by writing without thinking, he's going to produce this amazing avant-garde novel. But in fact, what he does is just to regurgitate awful parodies of all the bestsellers he's read over the years. So what you end up with is this very fast-paced comedy crime caper that takes the mickey out of all of the tropes of best-selling fiction. And all the way through the book, what's happening is that Marco is deciding what happens next by writing the very next thing that comes to mind, and then immediately regretting it because all his decisions, his subconscious decisions, turn out to be stupid ones. And of course, it's really a metaphor for life, Sarah, because in real life, you have to make all these decisions and you can't go back and change them. So you can read the book in one or two ways. You can either read it just as a comedy thriller, or if you're that way inclined, you can read between the lines and admire all the metafictional machinery that it contains.
We need to take our first break because it's time, and also because we all probably need to just wrap our brains around what's going on with this interview and this book and the craziness that is involved in writing a book that's being written at the time it is being written. I don't even know how to make that sentence make more sense. But when we come back, we'll be talking a bit more about this process of Marco writing the book as he goes along and creating plot points out of thin air. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am smiling. I hope you can hear it in my voice because I have such fun with these books and with Denis talking to him about these books. If you don't follow him on Twitter, you should, because he's just as funny, odd, lovely on Twitter as he is in this interview. And when I say odd, I mean that in the kindest, most dear possible way, because he's just a lovely man. At any rate, let's go ahead and get back to the interview. We're talking about The Awful Truth About the Herbert Quarry Affair. It is the prequel, so book 1 or book 3 in the Marco Ockram series.
I mentioned before we started recording that it's a good thing that we do not live closer. We're in different countries because I would have to call you all the time while reading the books because I would have to talk to you about every random little thing that made me laugh. But in terms of what you said about Marco writing the book as he goes along, here is something that popped out at me. It's on page 24 when Marco is examining the body of the victim in the book, and he writes, "I also noticed she had no unusual birthmark on her right heel. Yes, that's right. I said no birthmark. I even checked it twice to be sure, just in case it became important later in the book." I mean, you're reading and you're like, what? Okay, why?
And I think that's Marco all over. So in fact, I've invented this term, which is an Ockramism. And an Ockramism, Sarah, is a literary concern or shortcoming which is foregrounded by the author rather than corrected. So through all his books, Marco's always making these dreadful mistakes as an author. And rather than fixing any of them, because he's got this principle that he'll never edit anything that he's written, he brings them to your attention as the reader. So the kind of thing that would happen would be if Marco needs to get in his car in a hurry, and 3 chapters ago he left his car 10 miles away, then he'll just get into his car and he'll forget about the fact that he's just made a massive continuity error by doing it. And he'll acknowledge it to you, the reader. He'll say, I'll have to make a continuity error here because otherwise I haven't got time to go back and get my car. So all the way through the book, you've got these very self-reflexive observations that Marco, the author, is making about his own awful authorship, if that makes sense.
Yes. So how is it for you writing the writer? I mean, obviously you have to put more thought into it. You're not just writing things down and then hoping that they come out in the end, or are you?
Well, I kind of do and don't follow Marco's writing advice. The bit I don't follow is Marco says you must never edit anything. So according to him, his books are just typed in real time without a single alteration. And I edit my books to death. It takes me, the amount of time it takes me to polish my books is probably 4 times longer than it takes me to write them in the first place. So I edit them to death. But the piece of Marco's writing approach I do religiously follow is that he always writes the next thing that comes into his head. And whenever I reach a kind of point where I have to decide what happens next, I always go with the very first idea that comes into my head, and I force myself to make it work. So if I suddenly say, right, what's going to happen now is a warehouse is going to go on fire, then I must write that the warehouse is going to go on fire. But obviously, I spend lots of time trying to figure it all out to make sure it's funny and so on and so forth. Whereas Marco would claim that he's just typing it entirely off the top of his head. So I don't really know where the books are going next, Sarah. I have an idea of where they're going to end up. I have an idea of their overall theme, but I make a point of inventing them as I go along. And I do try not to think ahead if I can possibly help it. So let's suppose I was thinking of my next book, and let's suppose I fancied writing a Harry Potter spoof. So I was going to do something like The Awful Truth about a wizard school. Then I'd decide on that overall theme. I'd next decide on what the ending was going to be, because all of Marco's books have ridiculous endings where he, as an awful author, has written himself into such a predicament that he has to have a truly unbelievable plot twist to get out of it. So I would decide on what my the nature of my awful plot twist at the end was going to be. So it might be the kind of thing that happens with Marco is that he'd be surrounded by blokes with guns who are going to kill him, and he's tied up, and so the only way out of it is something would happen, like a sudden volcano would explode and the lava flow would wash away all the villains while miraculously leaving him unharmed. So I decide what the big ending is going to be, and that's it. I'm off. And of course, all the books start in exactly the same way. They all start with Marco getting a phone call from his main character, Como Galahad, who's a police chief. And what usually happens is Como rings him and tells him about something that sounds like a very innocuous case. And Marco goes to see Como, and the two of them investigate this innocuous case that, of course, turns out to be something absolutely, like one of the world's biggest crimes that Marco always solves with Como's help.
Right, and then, becomes even more famous in his own head or world or something.
Yes. So again, for listeners who aren't familiar with the books, Marco, although he's an idiot and he's a bit geeky, he's a mummy's boy. So I don't think he lives with his Bronx mom, but he's definitely still tied to his Bronx mom's apron strings the whole time. And I'm sure she cuts his hair and decides what clothes he should wear. But Marco, according to him, is the world's top celebrity author. So people are always stopping him in the street to ask him questions about his books and get him to sign copies of them. So he's like dead famous. And every book he writes breaks the record for the fastest selling book of all time. So heaven knows by the time he's on his book 10, everybody on the earth would have to buy them to keep the trajectory going. So he thinks he's really famous. Yeah.
Right. I mean, he's so famous that even before his books about the Awful Truth books take off, he is so famous that his scientific theory book is a bestseller, and people recognize him as the author of this science book, and they get excited to meet him.
Yes. So Marco has famously postulated the existence of a new fundamental particle called the tau muon. And he wrote a book about it called The Tau Muon. And that became an unexpected bestseller, and everybody bought The Tau Muon. And Marco's always appearing on chat shows to explain to everybody what a Tau Muon is. And that's another example, actually, Sarah, of making something up off the top of your head, because I invented the Tau Muon. Even though I've got a doctorate in theoretical physics, I couldn't quite remember the difference between a tau and a muon. So I thought, oh, bugger it, I'll call it a tau muon. So that's how it came about. But in Marco's world, the tau muon is this mysterious chimera particle that sometimes, a Jekyll and Hyde thing that sometimes acts like a tau and other times acts like a muon. And he is always being pestered by his fans who want to know more about tau muons wherever he goes.
When we spoke a while ago, I think on Twitter or on email, I don't even remember, you had mentioned that there were a couple of typos in my copy of the book, because I have an ARC copy. But are typos really a thing in Marco's world, or can you just write them off, haha, no pun intended, as part of Marco's weird writing process?
Well, that's an interesting point. Marco's books do contain lots of deliberate typos, but they're ones I have planted because I think they are funny or clever in some way. So, for example, in Marco's books, you get a lot of wordplay on homophones, so on words that are spelt differently but sound the same. And so very often you'll find typos where Marco appears to have typed the wrong word, and he'll make a joke out of it in some way. So the books are full of what appear to be technical errors, but my aim is that all the technical errors you see in the book are the deliberate ones. So I try not to have any accidental ones. But of course, having a book that's full of deliberate errors is good camouflage. So if you do have an accidental error, the reader will probably think, this must be one of Marco's jokes. I don't quite get it, but I'm sure it must be very clever.
That is very convenient.
Yeah.
With this book, there are the chapters all start with a brief conversation between Herbert and Marco about lessons in writing. So when you were, I was going to say when you were planning out the book, but did you start
planning
with those
is too
lessons?
Strong a word.
Yeah. I don't know what word to use. But did you start with those lessons and then work the chapter around them, or did you know what the chapter was going to be and kind of have Herbert give Marco some ridiculous advice to fit what that chapter content was?
Yeah, a bit of both. Mainly, I invented the lessons, and then I had Marco write a chapter in which he contravened some principle or advice that Herbert had given him in the lesson. And sometimes, for example, listeners who are writers might know of something called talking head syndrome as an example, which is where a writer has a dialogue between two characters where all they do is speak, and after a while you get confused about who's speaking. And Herbert advises Marco to avoid that by inserting little action beats in the dialogue, so that if the dialogue is Denis was talking to Sarah, then Denis might scratch his head at the end of something. So he has like a little action beat, and that reminds you that it's Denis saying that line. So Herbert explains this to Marco, and teaches him to look out for talking heads. And in the very next chapter, of course, Marco has this massive instance of dialogue between two people. It's pure talking heads. It's like really extreme example of it. And rather than inserting little actions through the dialogue, Marco realizes at the end of the dialogue that he's committed this sin, and so he gets all these actions that should be peppered through the dialogue. He gets them all down in one line at the very end. So he makes his character Jacqueline do a whole series of actions at the very end of the dialogue to compensate for the fact that there's no actions sprinkled through the dialogue. So that's a typical contrived joke in these books is there'll be a lesson at the start of the chapter where Herbert will explain or impart some writing advice to Marco that Marco then immediately either forgets or misunderstands.
Time for that second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking, of course, more about the book, more about these lessons that are at the beginning of each chapter, and then the sayings or the in which sentences, statements at the beginning of each chapter as well. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about the lessons that Herbert imparts to Marco. There are lessons at the beginning or the end of each chapter, I guess, however you look at it, between each chapters, between the chapters, my goodness, I cannot talk today. At any rate, that's what we were talking about. And then also each chapter starts with, in which Marco XYZ. So he usually breaks whatever rule Herbert has just imparted to him in those lessons. And I mentioned this and even read you some of that at the beginning of this interview. The chapter and the scene right before the lesson and the in which that I read you at the beginning of the episode, that chapter contains something that I really, really don't want to give away, but man, I want to bring it up because it's so indicative of how this book is and how zany it is, how circular it is. It makes me laugh. It makes me roll my eyes sometimes. It always makes me smile. And I really want to give it away, but I don't want to give it away. You have to read it so that you can be surprised like I was surprised. But let's go ahead and turn back to the interview so we can hear Denis talk more about Marco learning from Herbert. Yeah, all that good stuff. Let's get back to the interview.
Yes, which is always foreshadowed by the chapter title, chapter...
Usually, yes.
Yeah,
So
in which Marco, etc.
Yes, yeah. So all the chapters have titles which describe what happens in the chapter, usually in a very ironic kind of way.
Yes. Slightly random question, but as I was flipping back through the book while you were speaking, there's a part where Marco is talking about his appearance on the Nusha Winfrey show.
Yes.
Don't you have a friend on Twitter named Nusha?
I do, and the Nusha Winfrey reference is in honor of Nusha because she has been a huge supporter of Marco's, and she also is an eagle-eyed proofreader. So one of the reasons why the Marco's books are full of deliberate mistakes but have hardly any accidental ones is that Nusha goes through for me and spots all the shortcomings. And what I found amazing is I thought I was a pretty tidy writer. You know, I take a lot of care over my books. And then I'd send it to Nusha and, you know, she'd come back with 80 mistakes, you know. And admittedly, the mistakes tend to be things like, well, you used a full stop instead of a colon between where you've written 08:45 as a time of day. You should have used a colon instead of a full stop. So they tend to be relatively minor mistakes, but nonetheless, you find hundreds of them, which is always a source of great shame to me. So I've honoured her contribution to world literature by including Nusha as one of the characters at the start.
I love that. And again, totally random, but these things occur to me at weird times. Do you feel like Marco as a character is evolving, or is he just as well? There's Marco as a character, and then there's Marco as you're writing him. Is he evolving as a character, or just staying Marco, or also is he evolving? Is your writing of him evolving? Let me put it that way.
Yeah. My writing is definitely evolving, and it might be interesting to talk about why this book wasn't published originally. Marco came about because I read a book by Joel Dicker called The Truth About the Harry Caber Affair, and I decided to spoof it in an Amazon review. So I wrote this like 2 sample chapters of a spoof of that book, and a number of people who I'd love to be able to thank, but there's no way of getting in touch with them on Amazon, left comments to say that they thought the review was better than the book, and that Marco really should write a full book. So I did. I wrote this full book. But the original conception of Marco was that he was a truly awful writer. So every one of his sentences would be really, really dire. And I just, at the end of it, I had a book that was very funny, but was so badly written. I was seriously worried, Sarah, that people might think that it was badly written unintentionally because I was an idiot, rather than it was badly written deliberately. And so the way in which Marco has changed over the course of 3 books is he's become, in some ways, quite a polished writer. So some aspects of Marco's prose are actually quite sophisticated, and he employs a very wide range of figures of speech, for instance. But what he's bad at, he remains bad at plotting. So now he's really a very literate, awful plotter, really. So I think the quality of his prose has improved, but the quality of his plotting has probably got even worse, I would guess, over the course of the 3 books. And as a character, Marco hasn't changed much. He's a bit of a touchstone character, really. He is geeky. He is a mummy's boy. He is far more stupid than he thinks. But at the same time, Sarah, I hope at the same time that he's quite an uplifting kind of character. Although he is stupid, and although he does get into all kinds of trouble, at the end of the day, it's a kind of optimistic stupidness. It's like watching Laurel and Hardy, for example. Although they do stupid things, they do them in a way that cheers you up. And the whole point of the book, really, or the books, is to cheer people up.
Right, because at the end of the day, at least hopefully you are slightly smarter than Marco. Hopefully. Do you do any kinds of research for your writing, or do you just let Marco invent things?
Yeah, I largely let Marco invent things. I think for this book, there might have been 2 things that I did look up. I definitely looked up the make of the car that Starsky and Hutch used to drive in that series. And when I was looking that up in Wikipedia, I also noticed that the Starsky and Hutch call sign was something like Zebra 1 or Zebra 3. And so that appears in the book. So that there are probably 2 items of information in the book that are true and that I looked up in Wikipedia, but almost everything else is just nonsense. Marco makes everything up. I take pride in the fact that hardly anything in the book is true. I take the view, Sarah, that fiction is fiction, that what you're paying an author for is to make stuff up, and if all they do is research loads of facts and regurgitate them on the page, that's kind of cheating in my book.
very different then from your degree in physics, I would assume. At least I hope you're not just making stuff up.
Now, there's a little secret that we need to keep a secret. If I admit to everybody how all that was made up, I'll get into no end of trouble, Sarah. Yeah.
Okay, changing the subject. When you've described the book as satire, or as spoof, you've described it as comedic thriller. How does your publisher put it in a specific genre, or are they just mad at you all the time for the way you write?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, because I think I said at the start, I've never read a book remotely like them, and I'm not quite sure, even after thinking about it for several years, I still struggle to frame the books for people, to explain what they're like. And as far as genre goes, I think they are first and foremost comedies. So if there was a humour shelf, that's where they'd sit. Whether they are then thrillers or whodunits or cozy mysteries is really hard to say. That the link with those categories is much more tenuous, I think. So I think of them myself as literary comedies. That's the way I think of them. And my main objective in writing them is to make them fast-paced and funny. And if I achieve that, I also go to a lot of trouble, to be honest. I also go to a lot of trouble to put things in between the lines, to insert cleverness in them in a way that it doesn't hit you in the face. You'd have to. Some of the jokes, I imagine, are lost on some readers, at least some readers. But I don't care, as long as they have a laugh reading the books, as long as they at the end of the book they feel uplifted and they've been smiling or laughing to themselves as they're going through. That's my main objective, and if I achieve that, I'd be very happy.
Yeah, and you never know how people are going to take a joke anyway. So
exactly,
you could craft it. You could craft it for hours and still have someone read it in a different way than you intended.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I learned that lesson myself on Twitter. The other night, I had a message from Twitter inviting me to click on a topic of funny tweets. It said, here are the funniest tweets from the last 2 weeks. And I clicked on this list of tweets, and I didn't laugh at a single one of them. I thought, why on earth are these classed as funny tweets? So it just goes to show that a sense of humour is a very personal thing, Sarah.
Yep, especially when it is written so there's no inflection.
Yes.
Yes. Are there autobiographical elements within the stories? I mean, are there bits of your personality within some of the characters?
No. No. Not at all, I don't think. I suppose there are a couple. I mean, Marco used to be brilliant at every individual sport. So surfing, skiing, mountain climbing, anything like that, Marco used to be brilliant at. But then he got a middle ear problem that ruined his balance, so he's no good at anything anymore. And that's kind of autobiographical. Not that I used to be good at sports, but I did have a middle ear problem that made me fall over once, and I've never really recovered from it. So I still have atrocious balance. So that's autobiographical. And I suppose that Marco claims to be a physicist. Maybe that's autobiographical. And I think the other sense in which there's a slight degree of my personality in it is that Marco wants to break the mold of literature. Marco has his mission to go out and write books that are really popular but different. And I think that is also my mission, to write books that are popular but different.
Time for that last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about what Denis or Marco are up to next. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Denis Shaughnessy about his awful series, the Marco Ockram series, and the current book we are talking about, which comes out on June 15th, The Awful Truth About the Herbert Quarry Affair.
This is jumping the gun because this book doesn't even come out until June 15th, but are you working on a fourth Marco book yet?
Yes, I am. Yes. So
Yay.
my fourth book is reasonably advanced now. I think I'd only just started it when we last spoke. But the fourth book starts in exactly the same way as all the others. So Marco gets a phone call from Como. It actually starts, Sarah, where Marco is under the spotlights in a prestigious venue in New York somewhere for an audience with Marco Ockram, which is like a charity event where all the A-list celebrities are paid thousands of dollars to sit and listen to ask Marco questions, basically. So he's up on the stage in his anorak, and they're asking him these questions about how to write bestsellers and so on and so forth, and he's answering them. And of course, you can imagine the kind of fun and games that happens there with the sorts of questions that might get asked. Anyway, immediately after that, he gets this call from Como, and the story is about a Russian billionaire who has chartered the world's most luxurious cruise liner for a massive birthday party. And the cruise liner is full of a combination of millionaires, celebrities, and gangsters who are mates of this big crook whose birthday it is. And Marco's invited on the cruise as a celebrity to just like raise the intellectual tone of the event. And there's all sorts of skullduggery going on the ship. And of course, Como comes on board, the policeman comes on board. But once they're out of territorial waters, Como no longer has any kind of like official say in what happens. So the two of them are left to try and understand what's happening on this boat and avert disaster without any kind of formal role to play. You know, Como can't assert his police credentials because they're out in the middle of the ocean. He doesn't have any authority. So I know what the ending is going to be. I know what the crazy equivalent of the volcano exploding is going to be. But I'm only about halfway through at the moment, maybe 2/3 of the way through.
All right. Well, first, points for use of the word skullduggery. Nicely done. Second, for American listeners who may have not ever heard of an anorak, can you explain what that is?
Right. Okay. So in England, at least, an anorak is a waterproof coat, and typically for kids, an anorak would be a really unstylish waterproof coat that your mum buys you to go to school in, that you feel horribly self-conscious in. And the word anorak in the UK, at least, has come actually to mean a geeky kind of person, you know, so somebody who might be interested in train spotting or whatever. So an anorak is emblematic of somebody who's very, very uncool and unfashion conscious. So that's why Marco wears an anorak the whole time, because he's a bit of a geek and he's
and his
got
Bronx mom probably bought it for
fashion
him.
sense. Yeah, and his mum bought it for him. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's probably Sarah, at least a size too big, so that he can grow into it. That kind of
Probably,
thing.
yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Do you feel like your writing process has changed as you have written these 3 books?
Not really, no. The process is pretty much as I outlined it before. So I pick the theme, I pick the ending, it kicks off with a phone call from Como, and then I invent every scene as the very first idea that comes into my head. And then I work it and work it and work it and work it and work it. And sometimes the working of it takes ages. So, for example, in my current book, Marco has just come out of the sick bay on the ship, on the liner, where he's met somebody who's just like Bones McCoy out of Star Trek, incidentally. And as he walks down a corridor, he goes past all these doors that mark no admittance, strictly no admittance. And so, being an idiot, Marco then starts to have a riff about how it is that shipbuilders spend all this money installing doors that no one's allowed to use. Why would you put all these doors in if no one's allowed to use them at all? And he's so idiotic that he then, I had this idea that he would then get into this internal tirade about corruption in shipyards. The idea that maybe this shipbuilder had a big stack of unused doors, so he bribed the naval architect to change the plans so he could stick all these unused doors in the ship with a strictly no admittance sign and charge the ship owner for them and so on. And then that leads to more and more outlandish thoughts about different ways in which a shipbuilder could be corrupt. And I had this idea about the doors with the no admittance sign being pointless. And I had this idea about him thinking about corruption in a shipyard. But to turn that into, half a page of really funny interior monologue of Marco's took hours, to get the joke right and to get the wording right and to make it really funny rather than just a bit funny. So I have these ideas and I think, right, I'm going to make that work, and then I make it work. Regardless of how long it takes, I'll make it work, and then I'll move on to the next bit. So the next bit I'm about to move on to is Marco is going to misunderstand port and starboard. So because he's on the boat, he thinks he should start using port and starboard instead of left and right. And of course, he doesn't realise that port is only left if you're looking ahead. You've got to be looking ahead for it to be to port. Whereas he thinks it's just left and right. So if you turn around and face the back of the ship, what used to be the starboard is now the port, and so on. And so he's going to get totally mixed up about this, and he's going to have another rant about the fact that it's no wonder there are so many collisions at sea when people are mixing up their ports and the starboards. But of course, it's only him that's mixing it up.
That's right. I am scared to ask, but Marco's Bronx mom is always trying to fix him up with the daughters of her friends.
Yep.
Is Marco ever going to have a relationship? Because that scares me a little bit.
Well, that's a good point. I'm not quite sure, actually, because in the latest book, he does meet somebody who he kind of falls in love with right at the start, who's on the cruise with her mum. And, of course, when this girl meets him, she's utterly thrilled. She says, it's amazing. I'm so thrilled to meet you. And Marco thinks she's thrilled on a personal level to meet him, but actually it turns out she's thrilled because her mum likes him. And so she introduces Marco to her mum. And then, Marco can't escape her mum then. And the girl herself has got no interest in Marco whatsoever, much to his chagrin. But I don't know where that's going to end up. I don't know whether whether this girl is going to play a part in Marco's emotional life later in the book yet. We'll have to see how that goes.
Mm-hmm. Fun. What have you been reading when you are not immersed in Marco's world?
Well, I'm so busy. I am so busy. I hardly find time to read at all. So what I tend to do is listen to audiobooks. So I've discovered audiobooks over the last couple of years, and I listen to all kinds of audiobooks a lot when I'm outside doing jobs. And one of the things I've recently got into is listening to audiobooks about screenwriting, because I've been encouraged by a number of people to think about turning Marco's books into screenplays. So, and I think some of the jokes in Marco's books are just desperate for being turned into films. You know, some of them are just naturals for film. So I've started to really get into listening to audiobooks about how to write screenplays, and it is amazing what an industry that seems like. You know, that the whole filmmaking industry is very specialized and highly traditional in its approach to things. And my style of writing books, which is to, you know, just make it all up as you go along, would be utterly frowned upon by professional screenplay writers, because they go about it in such a disciplined and structured way, and there's particular structures that they're used to, or particular ways of structuring things that people in that industry are really familiar with, and therefore they expect you to be able to talk about your screenplay and your screenplay ideas in terms of these structural concepts. So they were totally alien to me, but I'm getting into them now. So I'm hoping to be able to, with the help of a mentor, a very clever mentor, I'm hoping to be able to pull together some decent screenplays that you know, more for fun than for anything else. I understand that every year there are about 10,000 speculative screenplays, out of which maybe 2 get bought. You know, so the chances are that any screenplay anybody ever writes will just end up in a wastebasket. And I'm quite prepared to accept that my screenplays will end up in a wastebasket. But I'm having such fun writing them that I'm prepared to carry on and see if I can produce something quite polished.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that sounds challenging, but fun.
Well,
maybe I don't know if it's fun.
Well, the challenge, of course, is how do you make a movie version of Marco's approach to writing books? So in the books, of course, it's like extremely metafictional, like extremely with 11 E's metafictional, and Marco breaks all the rules of book writing. So I was thinking that what I want to do is to write a screenplay that does the movie equivalent of that. So how would you break all the rules of producing a movie, and what's the best way to produce a kind of totally meta-cinematic film, and how would you frame it? So that's the challenge, is to to find a way to incorporate the weirdness of Marco's books into a movie, and still keep them weird, but not so weird that you'd lose an audience. And I think it's quite tricky. Right.
Yeah, I was thinking that when you were talking about it. I can't quite even imagine how that process would work.
Yeah. There's like the famous line you talked about on our last talk, so which is like one of the classic ochronisms, is in The Name of the Rose, where at one point a monk. So this is The Name of the Rose is a book about all kinds of wrongdoings going on in a celebrity retreat that's run like a medieval monastery. And at one point in the book, a totally scared monk comes racing out of a building, pulling his hair out, and he shouts that when people ask him what's happening, that he shouts that it's Stan has come amongst us, and it turns out that Stan is a typo, and it should be Satan. So he should have said it's Satan. But Marco makes the two typos. It's Stan has come amongst us, and then as the character, he reacts to the typo. So as his own character, he and the abbot are then scratching their heads, thinking, "Who's Stan? Who's this Stan person?" And it's only after a while that he realizes that it was a typo, and he retypes the line. So the monk says, "It's Satan. Satan has come amongst us." And so I'm thinking, well, how do you do that in a movie context? What's the movie equivalent of making a mistake like that, carrying on with the mistake and misunderstanding it as a consequence, and then spotting the mistake and correcting it? How do you do that in a movie? So it's quite an interesting challenge. I've got a draft of that scene, but I'm still not sure I've got it exactly right.
Interesting. Wow. Well, we've mentioned Twitter quite a few times. You're very active on Twitter and very amusing on Twitter. Actually, before I get to the question I was going to ask, I'm going to ask, did your tweets just come to you, or do you craft them? Because they're always very sort of Marco-esque in their wording.
Yeah, I sometimes get into trouble with my tweets. I like to tweet things that are in that kind of very interesting border area between being funny and serious. So where it's possible, they're very ironic, my tweets, or tend to be, and I write them in such a very straight, so it is possible for some people to think they're serious. And I very often get replies from people who think they're serious. And when that happens, it's sometimes quite tricky to point out to them, actually, this was all just a joke, after they've taken something very seriously. So they do tend to just come to me in a flash. As the idea, it's just like writing the books, actually. The idea comes to me in a flash, but then I do on they're like set pieces, so I do spend a lot of time crafting the words for my tweets, and I like it. I like it especially, Sarah, if I can write a tweet that's exactly 280 characters, my little Fabergé egg tweets that are bang on the limit. I get an extra sense of satisfaction for doing that.
Dang it, now you're going to make me count the characters of your tweets. Okay. Good to know. In terms of Twitter and social media in general and the internet in general, can you tell people where they can find you, website, social media, etc.?
Yeah, I'm not very good at social media. I try using Facebook, but I just find it maybe it's my computer or my broadband, but I just find it so glacially slow. I always run out of patience before the site comes up. So I tend to just use Twitter, where you can find me as Denis Shaughnessy without the S of Denis, so Denis running into Shaughnessy. And my website is theawfulauthor.com, all one word, theawfulauthor.com.
All right, thank you. Well, Denis, as usual, we have talked about a lot of different things, and it's been fun as usual, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure you brought up during our time together?
Well, I suppose I would heartily implore your lovely listeners to at least have a look at the books, Sarah, to go on Amazon and do the sneaky bit of taking a free look inside, just to see, just to get a feel of what they're like, because they are very different. Did you enjoy the third book?
I did. It was fun to read all of the things that were referenced in the first two books, because this is a prequel, and so it was fun to see where that story came from and how it developed. Also, the conversations with Herbert and Marco throughout made me laugh. And I don't want to give anything away, but I'm just going to say no, I can't even do that without giving it away. But there's a word that's repeated over and over, and it would be your crazy ending that gets them out of everything at the end. You use that word like 15 times in a row.
Yeah. Don't give that bit away. But don't forget, that is just the arc, and there is still 6 weeks. So, if you spot any big glitches, Sarah, in the book, make sure you ring me up and tell me to fix them before the book goes to press. Otherwise, I'll be in all kinds of trouble.
All right. I will let you know what I have found if I can find the notes where I jotted things down.
Yeah. The only last thing I'd mention is I've been working on something else which I call quills, Sarah. I don't know if you remember at the end of the Sushing Prize, the baddie, Professor Sushing, was talking about the fact that he had this scheme he called literary spectroscopy, where he analysed books and he could pinpoint aspects of their literary style. And that is an idea that I've been working on for years. And it arose from the fact that when I ask writers on Twitter if they could pinpoint the characteristics of their writing style, I always find they struggle to do so, or almost always they struggle to do so. And normally they answer the question by talking about what genre they write in or what topics they write about. And they never really are able to say what makes their style different, which I find a bit strange that writers don't analyse their style more explicitly. But I've developed, or I am developing, a scheme to try to quantify differences between the writing styles of different authors by going through at a kind of on a bottom-up level and pinpointing what it is that's idiosyncratic about a particular author's writing. And I think I'm still years away from turning it into something that's consistent and useful, but I've got far enough down the line to be confident that it will eventually get there. And I'm hoping, I've got a website that's up at the moment, but it's in too embryonic a state for me to want to share its URL with your lovely listeners. But hopefully within the next year or so, I hope to be able to publish it a bit more widely. And it's set up in the way that Wikipedia is a wiki. So the idea is that if I put enough into this website to give it intellectual critical mass, that hopefully other people will then come in as they do on Wikipedia and take over. So other people can come up with better ways of developing my idea. And the aim is that ultimately you'll be able to categorize books according to a very detailed and precise schema that tells you how they're written, not what they're about. So genre wouldn't really come into it, but it would just tell you how books were written, so that hopefully, if you understood the characteristics of books that you liked, that you would be able to use those characteristics to perhaps suggest or find other books that you might like. And this website would allow people to go through and upload the details of their favourite books and to classify them in this new way that I've developed. So I'm hoping something might come of that, but maybe not for another year or 18 months, I don't think.
Fascinating. How it's like you're a scientist or something, and you're using your skills for good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I definitely have that kind of analytic cast of mind, Sarah. The fact that I did my PhD was in physics, I think, makes me want to analyse stuff. And what I'm most interested in life is in writing, reading and writing. So it's natural for me to then turn my kind of analytic focus onto the art of writing. So that's how it's come about.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening. I know that you are probably in your jammies now and are ready to go to bed.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you from that. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me again.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Sarah. I feel genuinely honoured that you've had me back. Thanks ever so much.
Oh my goodness. Thank you to Denis for joining me from England in not the middle of the night. It was evening there for him. It was morning for me. But thank you so much, Denis, for putting up with more technical difficulties that we had. Not quite as bad as during our first interview when there was a crazy storm where you were. This time it was just some minor technical issues that we fixed rather quickly. Actually, Denis fixed them rather quickly. So thank you, Denis, for being a scientist and having a good brain, a crazy brain that brought us the Marco Ockram series, but I appreciate that as well. You, my listeners, definitely should check out this trilogy of awfulness because it is just, it's not your typical novel. It's not the typical thing that you read every day. Sometimes it will make you shake your head, roll your eyes, laugh out loud, wonder if where this idea came from of writing as you go along. Not that that's what Denis does, as he explained, but that's what Marco does. And just check it out, okay? Do me a favor. Go check out this series. This one comes out on June 15th, which means you have a little time to read the others or not. You could read this one first and then read the other two, or read the other two and then read this one as a prequel. Really, it's up to you. But thank you to Denis. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. If you're a fan of this podcast, please do me the favor of following us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can find me or the podcast there. We're kind of one and the same in terms of social media. Turns out the podcast does not post on social media. That's me. Little known fact. Follow us on social media. Also, if you're a fan of the podcast and would do me another favor, which is to leave a review, you can just leave 5 stars or whatever stars you feel like giving, or you can write a review. Either way, it helps us to get this podcast out to more book lovers such as yourselves, and definitely follow Denis on social media as well. He gave you all of his information at the end of the interview, so check him out, especially on Twitter, because he's fun and funny. I am joined, as I said earlier, by another returning author. This is her 3rd visit to the podcast. She's the 2nd author to return for a 3rd time. That author is Maddie Dalrymple. We'll be talking about her 3rd book in the Anne Kinnear suspense novel series. This is, suspense series. This one is called The Falcon and the Owl, and it's really good. So join me for that conversation with Maddie on the next episode. In the meantime, have a great week. Have a great day. Have just a great existence. And I hope that existence involves amazingly enormous amounts of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.